Well, it wasn't simply the development of these computers that becomes important in the development of Silicon Valley, but also what these computers can do and how they can connect to each other. And that particular thing, what we now know as the internet, actually had its development, partially at least, in Silicon Valley. I know when I was at graduate school at Stanford I started in '69 and I went to '73, and every once in a while you'd run into a computer type person and ask what about what's going on with in the engineering and the answer was we're trying to get computers to talk to each other, and I thought that was the most hysterical thing in the world, because I was thinking computers, what would computers sound like? What would their voices be like? They'd probably be like some of those aliens in, a War of the Worlds or something like that. But what they meant was they were trying to get computers to really communicate with each other. And the first time that had happened was on this date, October 29th, 1969, when a computer at UCLA, which is where this notation came from, was hooked up on the something called ARPANET, Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, funded by the military, and it was trying to connect with a computer at the Stanford Research Institute in Palo Alto, right? And as the thing says, this happened at 10:30 at night, when nobody else was using the computers. Loaded program, right? Talk to SRI, host to host, and basically what they did, the guys at UCLA and the people at SRI had a telephone connection, and the guys at UCLA would type in a letter, and they would then say on the open telephone line, "Can you see that?" Then the first letter, well, I just typed in L. Can you see L? And the answer came from Stanford, yes. Next thing, just typed in O. Can you see O? And the answer from SRI came back, yes, we can see that you just typed O. And the third letter that they typed was G. They were going to type login, I think, or something like that. And all of a sudden the system crashed. But those first two letters, L and O, were the first time that computers did actually talk to each other. And that was the beginning. I mean, it was obviously funded by the military for military purposes. But of course, it had a tremendous impact whatsoever. And actually, interestingly enough, the first major developments of that didn't happen in California. The first major developments of that happened at the University of Illinois. In 1993, a group of computer nerds, led by a fellow named Mark Andreessen, developed something called a mosaic, which they said, as you can see there, an internet information browser and World Wide Web client. Right? It was developed at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. It basically became, it was the first attempt at a browser, as more and more computers were talking to each other, and as more and more people were kind of setting up these sites to enable them to talk to other computers. How do you kind of unify the whole thing? Well, it was developed at the University of Illinois in 1993, but by that time, it was pretty clear that if you wanted to get at the center of where these kinds of things were happening, you moved to California and you moved to Silicon Valley. And so Andreessen and some of his team did. And in 1994 and 95, they developed the first real browser called Netscape. Some of you probably remember Netscape. I certainly do. I mean, that's what we had. That's what everybody had, because that was kind of the way in which, it was just a phenomenal thing. There with a couple of clicks on your keyboard, you could be halfway around the country. It was just a a phenomenal kind of thing. And as these things developed, of course, and there's Netscape's stock sign and everything like that. And as these things happened, you get into the third Silicon Valley garage. This one in Menlo Park, where two Stanford graduate students figured out a way to enable, as these sites were proliferating all over the place, to enable people to really figure out how to find what they wanted, right? And that, of course, was Google, which has now evolved into a whole bunch of different kinds of companies. But they started in their garage in Menlo Park. As you probably know, or maybe don't, but after the success of Macintosh, and it was successful, even though Apple never really the Macintosh did not dethrone the PC, and that was what the idea was. It was supposed to dethrone the PC and drive it all out of business. Jobs and the board at Apple had falling out. Finally, Jobs leaves Apple in no uncertain terms. I mean, not very friendly terms whatsoever. Starts his own company, which doesn't really do very much. I think it was called Next or something. Apple, meanwhile, under a series of more traditional corporate leaders, flounders, and really doesn't really do very much at all. And finally, I forget the exact date, but finally they bring Jobs back, and he is actually at the helm during the next big technological innovation, and as miniaturization and voice and music become super important. And in 2001, Apple introduces something which it calls the iPod, and that's the original one back in 2001. And on the left, you see a series of developments of that. Basically, what the iPod allowed you to do was play music without carrying around a Walkman. Remember the Walkman? I mean, and you could, the Walkman was great, but it was kind of, you could walk, you couldn't really run, and you couldn't. It wasn't the most mobile kind of thing that was out there. The iPod enabled you to do that, to listen to music, to do everything that you wanted, to even to talk, to do tapings, do whatever you want. Taking miniaturization to a whole different kind of level. And what happens is that the iPod begins a different kind of miniaturization, a miniaturization which is more personal and which is more user-friendly. At the same time, other companies were developing cell phones or mobile phones. They weren't called cell phones yet; they were called mobile phones. And the first ones of those, if you can remember, back in the 90s, were very large. How they were mobile was not quite clear. I remember people carrying them around, and all of the paraphernalia that you need to carry it around would be just tremendous. And eventually, that stuff was miniaturized a little bit, and you got the flip phone. Remember the flip phone, which was a huge advance for the time. Well, Apple decided to kind of try to do a little bit more with that, and I think it was in 2007 that they made this.
This is a day I've been.
Sorry about that. I forgot to move the earphones down there, so hold on for a sec.
This is a day I've been looking forward to for 2.5 years. every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything. And Apple has been, well, first of all, one's very fortunate if you get to work on just one of these in your career. Apple's been very fortunate. It's been able to introduce a few of these into the world. In 1984, we introduced the Macintosh. It didn't just change Apple, it changed the whole computer industry. In 2001, we introduced the first iPod. And it didn't just change the way we all listen to music. It changed the entire music industry. Well, today, we're introducing 3 revolutionary products of this class. The first one is a widescreen iPod with touch controls. The second is a revolutionary mobile phone. And the third is a breakthrough internet communications device. So, 3 things. A widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone. And here it is. No. Actually, here it is, but we're going to leave it there for now. So, before we get into it, let me talk about a category of things. The most advanced phones are called smartphones, so they say. And they typically combine a phone plus some email capability, plus they say it's the internet, sort of the baby internet, into one device, and they all have these plastic little keyboards on them. And the problem is that they're not so smart, and they're not so easy to use. So if you kind of make a Business School 101 graph of the smart axis and the easy-to-use axis, regular cell phones are kind of right there. They're not so smart, and they're not so easy to use. But smartphones are definitely a little smarter, but they actually are harder to use. They're really complicated. Just for the basic stuff, people have a hard time figuring out how to use them. Well, we don't want to do either one of these things. What we want to do is make a leapfrog product that is way smarter than any mobile device has ever been and super easy to use. This is what iPhone is. Okay? So, we're going to reinvent the phone. Now, we're going to start with a revolutionary user interface. It is the result of years of research and development. And, of course, it's an interplay of hardware and software.
that you can see was the. I mean, that goes on and on, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of that. My friend whom I was mentioning earlier was at that event, that kickoff event for the iPhone, and she said that a lot of the hooting and the noise that you hear is a number of the engineers who had little flasks that they had brought in, and they were just sipping their flasks of booze because they were absolutely petrified that when he got to the demonstration, the thing wasn't going to work. And actually, they didn't actually. The iPhone itself didn't come out for a number of months because there were still plenty of bugs in it. There, of course, is another side to all of this.